Blackridge State Correctional Facility stood like a fortress against the gray morning sky, its towering concrete walls casting long shadows over layers of razor wire and steel fencing. Every day began the same way. Heavy gates rolled open with mechanical precision. Officers passed through multiple security checkpoints, and the echo of clanging cell doors reminded everyone inside that freedom ended at the perimeter. For nearly 10 years, Officer Rebecca Lawson had walked those same corridors with unwavering professionalism. She knew every housing unit, every surveillance blind corner, and nearly every inmate by name. Fellow officers admired her steady judgment during tense situations, while supervisors trusted her enough to assign her some of the facility's most demanding responsibilities. To new recruits, Rebecca represented exactly what a correctional officer should be: calm, disciplined, and impossible to intimidate. No one noticed how carefully she separated her professional image from her personal life. Outside the prison, silence greeted her every evening. The small suburban house she once shared happily with her husband had become little more than a place where two exhausted strangers crossed paths. Years earlier, they had dreamed of building a family, traveling together, and escaping the pressures of ordinary life. Instead, endless overtime shifts, financial strain, and emotional distance had slowly dismantled the marriage piece by piece. Arguments no longer exploded into shouting matches. They had become something colder. Long stretches of silence filled the rooms, interrupted only by practical conversations about bills, groceries, or work schedules. Sometimes entire evenings passed without either of them asking how the other's day had gone. Rebecca often found herself lying awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling and wondering when companionship had quietly disappeared from her life. Ironically, the prison felt more predictable than home. Inside Blackridge, every rule had a purpose. Every movement followed procedure. Every risk could be measured. People, however, rarely followed rules as neatly. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Rebecca completed a routine inspection of C Block, the minimum security financial crimes unit. Most inmates were quietly reading, playing cards, or watching television in the common area, while officers completed scheduled counts. As she approached one particular cell, a calm voice interrupted her concentration. "Morning, Officer Lawson. Looks like the weather finally decided to match everyone's mood." Rebecca looked toward the speaker. The inmate stood with remarkable composure, holding an open paperback novel beneath the dim fluorescent lights. His uniform was neat, his posture relaxed, and unlike many prisoners eager for attention, he didn't crowd the bars or raise his voice. His identification card read, Daniel Cross. He was serving an 8-year sentence for multiple counts of financial fraud involving investment scams that had destroyed dozens of families' savings. Unlike violent offenders, Daniel possessed an unsettling calmness that made conversations with him unexpectedly easy. Rebecca offered only the brief nod expected from an experienced officer. "Keep your comments to yourself, Cross." He smiled politely rather than defensively. "Fair enough." She continued her inspection without another word. The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. Still, something about his composed demeanor lingered in her thoughts longer than it should have. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed during routine rounds. Daniel never asked inappropriate questions, never tested boundaries, and never behaved like inmates hoping to manipulate staff. Instead, he commented on books, current events, or observations about prison life with unusual intelligence. Rebecca answered only with short, professional responses, at least at first. Eventually, those replies became complete sentence. Then brief conversations. She told herself it was harmless. Officers spoke with cooperative inmates every day. Maintaining respectful communication often reduced conflict inside correctional facilities. Nothing about their interactions violated policy. Yet she slowly noticed herself recognizing Daniel's voice before she saw him. On particularly difficult mornings after another sleepless night at home, she found herself choosing inspection routes that happened to pass through C Block first. The realization disturbed her enough that she deliberately altered her patrol schedule for several days. It didn't help. Instead, she caught herself wondering whether Daniel had been transferred to another assignment or simply wasn't scheduled in the common area. That thought unsettled her far more than she cared to admit. As Rebecca finished another evening shift, she signed her final security report and walked toward the staff parking lot beneath the fading orange sunset. She paused briefly before unlocking her car, replaying one of Daniel's harmless jokes from earlier that afternoon. Without realizing it, she smiled. The expression disappeared almost instantly. Sitting behind the steering wheel, Rebecca rested both hands against the dashboard and closed her eyes. She wasn't supposed to think about inmates after work. She certainly wasn't supposed to look forward to seeing one. For the first time in nearly 10 years of correctional service, Rebecca drove home wondering why tomorrow's shift suddenly seemed worth anticipating, and why the answer had a name: Daniel Cross. That single thought, innocent as it appeared, quietly marked the beginning of a dangerous path neither of them yet understood. The following weeks slipped into a routine that felt ordinary on the surface but carried invisible consequences beneath it. After realizing she looked forward to seeing Daniel Cross, Rebecca Lawson tried convincing herself that the feeling would disappear if she simply ignored it. She buried herself in paperwork, volunteered for additional patrols, and reminded herself that professional boundaries existed for a reason. Yet every effort to distance herself only made her more aware of his absence whenever she passed through C-Block without hearing his familiar voice. Daniel never demanded attention. That was what made him different. Whenever Rebecca entered the housing unit, he greeted her with quiet respect before returning to whatever book he happened to be reading. If she stopped to inspect nearby cells, he never tried to prolong the conversation. Instead, he waited patiently, speaking only when she addressed him first. One afternoon, she noticed the worn novel in his hands. "You've read that one 3 times already," she observed. Daniel smiled faintly. "The ending never changes, but sometimes the person reading it does." Rebecca couldn't help raising an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly philosophical for someone convicted of investment fraud." He chuckled softly. "Mistakes don't erase the ability to think." The reply lingered in her mind long after she completed the inspection. As autumn settled over Blackridge State Correctional Facility, their conversations gradually became part of Rebecca's daily rounds. They discussed literature, history, music, and occasionally current events broadcast on the common room television. Daniel possessed an unusual ability to listen without interrupting. Unlike nearly everyone else in Rebecca's life, he never seemed distracted or impatient. One rainy evening, she arrived at work exhausted after another sleepless night. Her husband had barely spoken during dinner before leaving the house without explanation. Rebecca spent hours staring at an untouched meal before reporting for the overnight shift. Daniel noticed immediately. "You look tired," he said quietly. "I'm fine. You don't sound convinced." Rebecca should have ended the conversation. Instead, she sighed. "Some days are just heavier than others." Daniel nodded, dead with genuine understanding. People spend years pretending they're strong because they think admitting exhaustion makes them weak. His words struck an uncomfortable truth. For a brief moment, Rebecca forgot she was speaking to an inmate. She simply felt heard. After that night, the invisible wall between officer and prisoner grew thinner. Rebecca occasionally allowed Daniel an extra few minutes in the recreation yard before calling the count. She overlooked insignificant uniform violations that normally earned written reports. Once, she quietly replaced a damaged paperback novel that had accidentally been discarded during a routine cell inspection. Each favor appeared harmless by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. Daniel never explicitly asked for these privileges. Rebecca offered them voluntarily, convincing herself they made no meaningful difference inside a prison filled with far greater problems. Not everyone failed to notice. An inmate named Marcus Hale watched Rebecca pause outside Daniel's cell more often than necessary. Marcus had spent years studying the behavior of correctional staff, understanding that small changes often revealed larger secrets. He never confronted Daniel. He simply observed. Meanwhile, veteran correctional officer Thomas Briggs also began sensing something unusual. With over 25 years inside Blackridge, Briggs recognized subtle behavioral shifts that younger officers overlooked. During one evening shift, he approached Rebecca after final count. You spend quite a bit of time talking with Cross. Rebecca kept signing paperwork without looking up. He stays cooperative, makes inspections easier. Briggs folded his arms. Maybe. Just remember that some inmates earn trust because they know exactly how to use it. Rebecca forced a polite smile. I appreciate the advice. Briggs studied her expression for another moment before walking away. His warning unsettled her, but only briefly. She assured herself that Daniel wasn't manipulating anyone. Their conversations remained respectful. Nothing inappropriate had happened. She believed she understood the difference between compassion and emotional involvement. She was wrong. Without realizing it, Rebecca had begun measuring difficult days by whether she had spoken with Daniel. A shift felt incomplete if their conversations were interrupted. His quiet encouragement lingered in her thoughts long after she returned home to an empty marriage and silent rooms. Daniel had become the person who understood her best. Rebecca still believed she controlled every boundary. She never considered the possibility that the boundaries had already disappeared. And somewhere inside Blackridge, Daniel quietly began realizing that Rebecca's trust might become far more valuable than either of them had ever imagined. Winter settled over Blackridge State Correctional Facility, covering the razor wire with thin layers of frost that disappeared each morning beneath the pale sun. Months had passed since Rebecca Lawson first realized she looked forward to seeing Daniel Cross. What had begun as harmless conversations during routine inspections had quietly transformed into something neither policy nor conscience could justify. Rebecca no longer arranged her patrols by efficiency alone. Instead, she volunteered for housing assignments that kept her near C Block, carefully swapping shifts with coworkers whenever opportunities arose. She justified every request with believable excuses, covering for sick colleagues, helping train newer officers, or balancing overtime schedules. No one questioned her reliability because she had spent nearly a decade earning everyone's trust. Daniel noticed the changes immediately. You don't have to keep finding reasons to come here, he whispered one evening while other inmates gathered for recreation. Rebecca glanced around before answering. I'm just doing my job. He smiled knowingly. We both know that's not entirely true anymore. For the first time, she didn't deny it. The invisible boundary between officer and inmate finally collapsed. Their conversations became longer and more personal, taking place in quiet corridors, empty supply rooms, and maintenance hallways where surveillance coverage was limited. Rebecca memorized camera rotations and security patrol intervals with frightening precision. Knowledge that had once protected the prison now protected their secret. Each meeting lasted only minutes. Yet those stolen moments became the center of Rebecca's emotional world. At home, her marriage continued unraveling beyond repair. Her husband barely acknowledged her presence, and every conversation dissolved into strained silence or quiet resentment. Rebecca stopped trying to repair what already felt broken. Instead, she found herself counting the hours until her next shift, where someone actually listened when she spoke. Daniel filled that emotional void effortlessly. He asked about her childhood, her dreams before becoming a correctional officer, and the books she loved reading as a teenager. Unlike anyone else, he remembered every answer. You deserve better than surviving each day, he told her softly during one meeting. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Sometimes surviving is all people get. No, Daniel replied. Sometimes people just forget they deserve happiness. Those words stayed with her long after their conversation ended. Eventually, fleeting touches replaced careful distance. A reassuring hand on hers lingered too long. Brief embraces became part of their hidden routine whenever they found secluded corners beyond the reach of cameras. Rebecca understood every second increased the risk of discovery, yet walking away became impossible. She convinced herself this wasn't manipulation. It was love. As weeks passed, Daniel slowly revealed fragments of the life that existed before prison. He described growing up in foster homes, struggling through poverty, and teaching himself finance before opening an investment company that eventually collapsed after a series of disastrous business decisions. He spoke of betrayal by former partners who blamed everything on him while escaping prosecution themselves. Rebecca listened with sympathy, but occasionally small details shifted. One evening Daniel claimed he had never married. Days later, he casually mentioned an ex-wife during another conversation. On another occasion, he insisted he had no living relatives before later describing a younger brother living overseas. Rebecca noticed the contradictions. She simply chose not to question them. Everyone carried painful memories differently, she reasoned. Trauma distorted recollections. Besides, confronting Daniel might damage the fragile connection they had built together. Believing him felt easier than doubting him. Meanwhile, hidden beyond a storage room doorway, prison maintenance employee Carlos Mendez paused while delivering repair equipment. Through the narrow opening, he saw Rebecca standing far closer to Daniel than any correctional officer ever should. Their hands separated the instant footsteps echoed nearby. Carlos quietly continued walking without revealing himself. He spent the rest of the day convincing himself he must have misunderstood what he'd seen. Reporting the incident could destroy a respected officer's career if he was mistaken. Remaining silent felt safer. Rebecca never realized anyone had witnessed that brief encounter. She believed their carefully planned meetings remained invisible. As spring approached, the secret relationship grew stronger while the foundation beneath it weakened with every hidden conversation, every stolen embrace, and every overlooked inconsistency in Daniel's stories. Neither of them noticed how dangerously close their carefully constructed illusion had drifted toward collapse. Soon, secrets would stop living only in whispered conversations. They would begin leaving evidence behind. Spring arrived at Blackridge State Correctional Facility with cold rain instead of warmth, leaving damp concrete walkways glistening beneath gray skies. Rebecca Lawson tried convincing herself that the anxiety growing inside her was nothing more than ordinary stress. Yet ever since she and Daniel Cross had crossed professional boundaries, every ringing telephone, unexpected meeting request, and passing glance from a coworker felt like the beginning of disaster. The first warning came quietly. The prison administration announced a routine internal audit of staffing records, security logs, and surveillance reports. Such inspections occurred every few months and usually attracted little attention. Officers grumbled about extra paperwork before returning to their normal duties. Rebecca tried to appear equally unconcerned. Inside, however, panic slowly tightened its grip. She knew she had exchanged patrol assignments more often than usual over the past several months. Individually, each schedule change appeared reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern that consistently placed her near C-Block. During Daniel's recreation periods, one afternoon, Lieutenant Howard Ellis stopped beside her desk. "Rebecca, the auditors may ask about your shift swaps." She looked up calmly. "Anything wrong?" "Probably not," he replied. "They just noticed you've requested more schedule adjustments than most officers this year." Rebecca forced a reassuring smile. "I've been covering for people whenever I could." Howard nodded. "That's what I figured." As he walked away, Rebecca released the breath she had been holding. For the first time since their relationship began, she understood that even innocent-looking decisions could become dangerous when viewed together. Later that evening, she found Daniel waiting near the library corridor during supervised movement. "They're reviewing records," she whispered. Daniel remained surprisingly composed. "Audits happen all the time. This one feels different." He gently reached for her hand before quickly letting go as footsteps echoed nearby. "We've been careful." Rebecca wanted to believe him. Instead, an unfamiliar sense of dread settled over her. Several days later, that dread became something far worse. Rebecca entered a storage room they occasionally used for private conversations. Daniel was already there, hurriedly slipping a small notebook into the pocket of his prison jacket. "What was that?" she asked. He hesitated only briefly. "Nothing important." Rebecca frowned. "Let me see it." Daniel remained motionless. "It's personal." His hesitation instantly alarmed her. After several tense seconds, he slowly removed the worn notebook and handed it to her. Rebecca opened the first page. Her heart nearly stopped. Every meeting they had shared was documented in careful handwriting. Dates, times, locations, conversations. Even seemingly insignificant details had been recorded with remarkable precision. One page described the exact afternoon she had replaced his damaged novel. Another mentioned the first time she had embraced him. In a maintenance hallway, there were references to shift changes, camera blind spots, and emotional conversations she barely remembered herself. Rebecca looked up in disbelief. "You've been writing all of this down?" Daniel answered quietly. "I wanted to remember." "No," she said, her voice shaking. "You created evidence." His expression hardened. "I wasn't thinking about evidence. Anyone who finds this could destroy both of us." Daniel stepped closer. "I trust you." Rebecca closed the notebook with trembling hands. "Then why keep a record at all?" He didn't answer. Silence filled the room. For the first time since their relationship had begun, Rebecca questioned whether she truly knew the man standing before her. Driving home after her shift, fear replaced every emotion she had once associated with Daniel. The notebook replayed endlessly in her thoughts. She imagined investigators reading every page, her husband discovering the affair, co-workers testifying in court, and television cameras waiting outside the prison gates. Everything she had built during 10 years of service suddenly felt fragile. The following week, Rebecca became noticeably distant. She shortened conversations. She canceled planned meetings. She avoided unnecessary eye contact. Daniel noticed immediately. "You've changed," he said during a brief encounter. "I'm being careful. You don't trust me anymore." Rebecca looked directly into his eyes. "I don't know what to trust." The warmth that had once defined their relationship disappeared, replaced by suspicion neither of them could hide. What Rebecca didn't yet realize was that the notebook was only one dangerous secret. Soon, fear would give way to manipulation, and trust would become the most valuable weapon either of them possessed. The fragile trust that had once held Rebecca Lawson and Daniel Cross together disappeared almost overnight. After discovering Daniel's handwritten notebook, every conversation between them carried an undercurrent of suspicion. The quiet comfort she had once found in his presence was replaced by constant uncertainty, and the prison that had always felt predictable suddenly became a maze of invisible dangers. Rebecca tried creating distance. She requested assignments in different housing units whenever possible and limited their conversations to brief professional exchanges. Whenever Daniel attempted to speak beyond official business, she ended the interaction and continued her rounds without looking back. Daniel accepted the change at first. At least that was how it appeared. Then one evening, while supervising inmate movement near the prison laundry, Rebecca found a folded piece of paper resting on the security desk. There was no name on it, only a single handwritten sentence. "We need to talk before someone else does." Her pulse quickened. She immediately recognized Daniel's handwriting. Later that night, during a scheduled maintenance inspection, Daniel quietly stepped into the narrow service corridor she had just entered. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Rebecca kept her voice low. "That's exactly what we should have done months ago." Daniel studied her face. "You think I'm your enemy now. I don't know what you are anymore." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I need your help." Rebecca's stomach tightened. "With what?" "I need access to the education office after lockdown." Her expression hardened. "Absolutely not. It's only for an hour." "No." Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. "If I can't get what I need, someone may eventually discover that notebook." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm asking you to understand my situation. You just threatened to destroy my life." Daniel lowered his voice even further. "I'm trying to protect both of us." Rebecca stepped backward. "No, you're protecting yourself." She walked away before he could answer. That conversation marked the beginning of something far darker than either love or betrayal. Over the following weeks, Daniel's requests became increasingly serious. At first, he asked Rebecca to overlook minor rule violations involving inmate movement. Then he requested additional phone privileges, extra recreation time, and access to restricted paperwork. Each refusal was met with the same calm reminder. The notebook still exists. Daniel never raised his voice. He never became physically aggressive. His quiet confidence frightened Rebecca far more than shouting ever could. She no longer knew whether he genuinely feared exposure or had carefully planned every step from the beginning. Sometimes he sounded desperate, insisting he simply wanted better treatment until his release. Other times his words carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who understood exactly how much power he possessed. Rebecca couldn't determine which version of Daniel was real. Perhaps both were. Outside the prison, her personal life completely unraveled. She barely slept. When exhaustion finally forced her eyes closed, nightmares pulled her awake within minutes. She dreamed of investigators reading Daniel's notebook aloud in court while television cameras broadcast every humiliating detail. She imagined prison staff whispering behind her back and her husband silently packing his belongings before walking out forever. Even simple sounds triggered panic. A ringing office telephone, an unexpected email, a supervisor asking for a private conversation. Every ordinary event felt like the beginning of exposure. Coworkers noticed the changes. Officer Thomas Briggs watched Rebecca lose track of routine paperwork twice in the same week. "You feeling all right?" he asked one afternoon. Rebecca forced a tired smile. "Just haven't been sleeping. You should take a few days off." "I'll be fine." Briggs didn't look convinced. Neither was she. The panic attacks began without warning. Sometimes while driving home. Sometimes while standing alone in the locker room. Sometimes in the middle of a routine security count, forcing her to hide trembling hands behind a clipboard until her breathing returned to normal. She stopped answering friends' phone calls. She barely spoke to her husband. Food lost its taste. Time blurred into endless shifts filled with fear. Rebecca became convinced that every hallway contained hidden witnesses and every surveillance camera somehow pointed directly at her. Daniel no longer needed to repeat his threats. His silence accomplished the same purpose. One evening, Rebecca sat alone inside her parked car long after finishing her shift. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while the prison walls stood dark in the distance. She closed her eyes and whispered words she never imagined she would think. "As long as Daniel is alive, I'll never be free." The realization horrified her. Yet instead of rejecting the thought, she found herself returning to it again and again. And somewhere deep inside the growing darkness of her exhausted mind, an unthinkable solution slowly began taking shape. For days after the terrifying realization in her parked car, Rebecca Lawson tried convincing herself that the thought had been born from exhaustion rather than intention. She repeated the same promise every morning before entering Blackridge State Correctional Facility. She would find another solution. She would report Daniel, confess the affair, or simply walk away from her career before allowing something irreversible to happen. But every shift erased that resolve. Daniel never stopped reminding her that the notebook still existed. He no longer needed direct threats. A brief glance, a quiet smile, or a whispered remark was enough to send Rebecca's pulse racing. She lived with the constant certainty that her entire life rested in the hands of the man she had once believed loved her. Fear slowly became determination. Rebecca began studying prison schedules with the same attention she had once devoted to protecting inmates and staff. Maintenance work was scheduled for the Western Utility Corridor on Thursday afternoon. Several surveillance cameras would temporarily lose coverage while technicians upgraded outdated wiring. Officers had already been informed that manual patrols would replace electronic monitoring for less than 15 minutes. Most employees viewed the interruption as routine. Rebecca saw something else. She quietly volunteered to supervise Daniel's movement during what appeared to be a standard transfer from the education wing back to C Block after a document review. The assignment raised no suspicion because she had handled similar responsibilities countless times before. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Thursday arrived beneath heavy clouds that darkened the prison yard long before sunset. The atmosphere inside Blackridge felt unusually quiet, broken only by distant announcements echoing through loudspeakers and the metallic sound of security doors opening and closing. Rebecca signed the transfer paperwork with steady hands. Inside, her thoughts were anything but steady. Daniel was escorted from the education office in standard restraints before the second officer, received an urgent radio call requesting assistance in another housing unit. Rebecca volunteered to finish the transfer alone, citing the short walking distance. The request was approved without hesitation. She and Daniel walked silently through the maintenance corridor. Neither spoke until they reached the section temporarily hidden from camera coverage. Daniel glanced upward. "So this is where you wanted to talk?" Rebecca stopped walking. "I wanted this to end." "It doesn't have to. It already has." Daniel studied her face for several long seconds. "You've been planning something." Rebecca's breathing became uneven. "I can't keep living like this. You think killing the relationship fixes everything?" "I wanted to save my life." Daniel slowly shook his head. "You should have trusted me." Rebecca's voice cracked. "I did." For the first time since they had met, genuine anger flashed across Daniel's face. "You stopped believing me the moment you found that notebook. You gave me every reason to." He stepped toward her despite the restraints. "I wrote those pages because I loved you." Rebecca backed away. "No, you kept them because you wanted control." Daniel reached forward as though trying to calm her. Rebecca reacted instinctively, shoving him backward. He stumbled against a steel maintenance cabinet with tremendous force. The impact echoed through the narrow corridor. Before either of them could recover, Daniel lunged forward again, shouting that she was making a terrible mistake. The struggle lasted only seconds. Rebecca grabbed a heavy metal flashlight attached to her equipment belt and swung it in panic. The blow struck the side of Daniel's head. He collapsed instantly. Silence filled the corridor. Rebecca stood frozen, staring at the motionless figure lying on the cold concrete floor. "Daniel!" Her voice barely escaped her lips. She knelt beside him with trembling hands and searched desperately for signs of movement. There were none. Blood slowly spread beneath his head. The realization hit with crushing force. Daniel Cross was dead. Panic overwhelmed every rational thought. Rebecca looked frantically in every direction before dragging his body toward a nearby maintenance access door. Working mechanically, she scattered broken tools across the floor, damaged a security lock, and forced open an exterior service hatch to create the appearance of an attempted escape. She removed anything that might immediately connect them, carefully checking the corridor before wiping obvious fingerprints from nearby surfaces. When the scene looked convincing enough, she activated her radio. "Officer down. Inmate escape attempt in the West Maintenance Corridor. Medical assistance immediately." Within moments, alarms echoed throughout Blackridge. Officers rushed toward the restricted area while emergency teams secured the building. Rebecca repeated the same story again and again, insisting Daniel had attacked her during the transfer before suffering fatal injuries while attempting to flee. Most people believed her. As investigators secured the scene, Rebecca watched paramedics cover Daniel's body with a white sheet. She told herself the nightmare was finally over. She had no idea that the carefully staged escape contained small inconsistencies impossible for an experienced investigator to ignore, and those overlooked details would soon place every lie under a microscope. The chaos that followed Daniel Cross's death spread through Blackridge State Correctional Facility within minutes. Emergency alarms echoed through every housing unit as inmates were ordered into lockdown. Officers rushed from corridor to corridor, securing doors and searching areas that had already been declared safe. By dawn, the prison had returned to its usual rigid routine, but an invisible tension lingered behind every steel gate. The administration moved quickly. According to Rebecca Lawson's statement, Daniel had attacked her during a routine transfer before attempting to escape through a maintenance access point. During the struggle, he suffered a fatal head injury after striking nearby equipment. Considering Daniel's criminal history and the damaged service hatch, prison officials viewed the explanation as both unfortunate and believable. An internal memorandum classified the incident as a failed escape attempt resulting in an inmate fatality. Most employees accepted that conclusion. One person did not. Detective Olivia Grant from the County Homicide Division arrived later that afternoon carrying a slim notebook instead of the confidence displayed by prison administrators. She had investigated violent deaths for nearly 15 years and had learned that scenes often revealed truths long before witnesses did. Olivia walked silently through the maintenance corridor where Daniel had died. She observed everything without speaking. The damaged cabinet, the scattered tools, the forced hatch, the dried blood staining the concrete. Nothing immediately proved Rebecca's account false. Yet something about the arrangement felt strangely deliberate. She crouched beside the impact stain on the floor before turning toward the maintenance exit. If he was running, she quietly asked the forensic photographer, "Why is the blood pattern here instead of closer to the hatch?" The photographer shrugged. "Could have fallen before reaching it." "Maybe." Olivia wrote a short note before continuing. Questions mattered more than assumptions. Over the following 2 days, she interviewed correctional officers one by one. Most accounts remained generally consistent. Rebecca appeared shaken but cooperative, repeating the same sequence of events with remarkable precision. She admitted pushing Daniel away during the confrontation but insisted everything afterward had happened too quickly to remember clearly. Olivia listened carefully. People recalling genuine trauma usually remembered emotions vividly while confusing smaller details. Rebecca remembered almost everything, almost too well. Meanwhile, Officer Thomas Briggs described Rebecca's behavior during the weeks before Daniel's death. "She wasn't herself," Briggs admitted. "In what way?" Olivia asked. "Distracted, tired, nervous." "Did she mention problems with the inmate?" "No." "Anything unusual?" Briggs hesitated. "I warned her not to trust him." Olivia looked up. "Why?" "He had a way of getting inside people's heads." That answer interested her more than Briggs realized. Next came maintenance employee Carlos Mendez. He nervously described seeing Rebecca standing unusually close to Daniel several weeks earlier before quickly insisting he hadn't witnessed anything inappropriate. "You didn't report it?" Olivia asked. Carlos lowered his eyes. "I wasn't sure what I saw." Olivia thanked him without revealing how significant that information suddenly became. Then forensic reports began arriving. Daniel's injuries immediately raised additional concerns. The medical examiner concluded the fatal head wound resulted from a powerful single impact rather than repeated blows or accidental contact with multiple objects during an escape attempt. There were also faint bruises on Daniel's wrists inconsistent with routine transport restraints. Even stranger, microscopic traces of cleaned blood appeared several feet away from where Daniel's body had ultimately been discovered. Someone had attempted to remove evidence. Olivia returned to the corridor alone that evening. Standing in silence, she mentally replayed Rebecca's version of events. Each step sounded believable, yet when connected to the forensic findings, the sequence refused to fit together. She requested surveillance recordings covering the previous 24 hours. Although camera maintenance had created a temporary blind spot during the reported confrontation, footage from surrounding hallways still captured everyone entering and leaving nearby sections of the prison. Olivia began constructing a detailed timeline. Every officer movement, every radio transmission, every maintenance request, every inmate escort. Piece by piece, Daniel's final day slowly emerged. Meanwhile, Rebecca fought a different battle. She barely slept after the investigation began. Every interview felt like an surveillance cameras and overwhelming guilt over crossing boundaries that should never have existed. Curiously, he never mentioned Rebecca Lawson by name. Instead, he referred to her only as R. Olivia closed the journal thoughtfully. It wasn't enough to prove murder, but it was enough to prove someone inside Blackridge had shared an intimate relationship with Daniel. The second discovery proved even more alarming. Internal affairs investigators uncovered evidence that several corrupt inmates had secretly operated an illegal communication network using smuggled cellular phones. After weeks of digital analysis, forensic specialists recovered encrypted messages from one damaged device found hidden inside an abandoned ventilation duct. Most conversations involved gambling, contraband, or financial transactions. A smaller collection stood apart. The messages revealed emotional exchanges between Daniel and an unidentified contact whose identity remained concealed through deleted account information. They discussed loneliness, trust, regret, and fear of discovery. One message warned that The cameras almost caught us today. Another mentioned changing work schedules to create private opportunities. The sender's identity remained unknown. Olivia quietly suspected she already knew. She simply couldn't prove it yet. Meanwhile, pressure inside the prison continued mounting. Correctional officers who had previously dismissed small irregularities suddenly began reconsidering old memories. One afternoon, Officer Nathan Collins requested a private meeting with investigators. "I should have spoken sooner," he admitted. Olivia remained silent, allowing him to continue. "About 4 months ago, I saw Officer Lawson leaving the old maintenance corridor during evening count. Was anyone with her? I didn't see clearly." He paused uneasily. But a few seconds later Daniel Cross walked out from the same hallway. Olivia wrote several notes. "Did you report it?" Nathan slowly shook his head. "They were separated. Nothing actually happened in front of me. But it felt unusual." Yes, his testimony alone couldn't establish guilt. Combined with everything else, however, it strengthened a rapidly growing pattern. By the end of the week, Olivia's investigation board displayed photographs, timelines, journal excerpts, maintenance schedules, surveillance maps, and witness statements connected by colored strings stretching across nearly every section. The picture remained incomplete, but its outline had become unmistakable. Rebecca sensed the change immediately. Co-workers who once greeted her warmly now seemed unusually cautious. Conversations stopped when she entered break rooms. Internal affairs officers appeared more frequently throughout the facility, quietly reviewing records and interviewing staff members. Every passing day tightened the invisible circle around her. Driving home one evening, Rebecca noticed an unmarked police vehicle parked briefly outside her neighborhood before pulling away. Perhaps it was unrelated. Perhaps it wasn't. Fear no longer allowed her to believe in coincidences. She returned home, locked every door, and sat alone in darkness with trembling hands. The weight of months of deception pressed against her until breathing itself became difficult. She understood the investigation had moved beyond suspicion. It was becoming personal. For the first time since Daniel's death, Rebecca admitted a truth she had desperately tried to avoid. Soon, investigators would no longer be searching for the officer identified only as R. They would be coming for Rebecca Lawson herself, and the choice between confession and another lie was running out of time. The arrest of Rebecca Lawson sent shockwaves through Blackridge State Correctional Facility and the surrounding community. A correctional officer once praised for integrity now stood accused of murdering an inmate with whom she had carried on a forbidden relationship. News outlets covered every development, transforming the case into a national discussion about prison corruption, abuse of authority, and the dangerous consequences of blurred professional boundaries. Months later, the courtroom filled before sunrise on the first day of trial. Journalists occupied nearly every available seat. Former co-workers sat quietly behind the prosecution, while Daniel Cross's surviving relatives gathered together on the opposite side of the gallery. The atmosphere remained heavy with expectation as Rebecca entered wearing plain civilian clothing instead of the correctional officer's uniform she had once worn with pride. She avoided looking toward Daniel's family. Detective Olivia Grant watched silently from the second row, her investigation files now stacked neatly beside the prosecutor's. The prosecution opened by presenting a clear and devastating timeline. Witness after witness described Rebecca's unusual schedule changes, secret meetings with Daniel, and growing emotional instability during the months leading to his death. Surveillance records, forensic evidence, maintenance logs, and excerpts from Daniel's journal painted the picture of a relationship that had gradually transformed into manipulation, fear, and ultimately violence. The prosecutor addressed the jury calmly. This case is not about a tragic accident. It is about an individual who abused her authority, feared exposure, and chose murder over accountability. The defense offered a different explanation. Rebecca's attorney acknowledged the inappropriate relationship but argued that Daniel had psychologically manipulated her until she believed escape was impossible. He described the hidden notebook, the repeated threats, and the crushing emotional pressure Rebecca endured as evidence of coercion rather than calculated malice. She made catastrophic decisions, the attorney admitted. But catastrophic decisions are not always carefully planned crimes. Several witnesses testified over the following days. Officer Thomas Briggs described Rebecca's dramatic personality changes before Daniel's death. Maintenance employee Carlos Mendez recounted seeing Rebecca and Daniel standing together in suspicious circumstances months earlier. Digital forensic experts explained the encrypted phone messages recovered during the investigation, while medical specialists demonstrated why Daniel's fatal injury contradicted the official escape narrative. Each testimony weakened Rebecca's original statement. Finally, Rebecca herself took the witness stand. The courtroom fell completely silent. She clasped her hands tightly before answering the first questions in a barely audible voice. "Did you have a personal relationship with Daniel Cross?" Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." The single word echoed throughout the courtroom. She admitted their conversations had evolved into an emotional attachment before becoming a secret romantic affair hidden inside the prison. She acknowledged violating countless professional rules and confessed that fear had consumed her after discovering Daniel's journal and believing he could expose everything. Tears filled her eyes. "I betrayed my badge, my marriage, and every promise I made when I became an officer." The prosecutor stepped forward. "Did you plan Daniel Cross's death?" Rebecca immediately shook her head. "No. You expect this jury to believe his death happened by accident." "I wanted the threats to stop," she answered through tears. "I never walked into that corridor intending to kill him." The prosecution challenged every inconsistency in her testimony, while the defense emphasized her panic, emotional collapse, and psychological dependence. Both sides delivered powerful closing arguments, asking the jury to interpret the same evidence through entirely different perspectives. After hours of deliberation, the jurors returned. The courtroom stood as the foreperson rose. Rebecca gripped the edge of the defense table, barely able to breathe. The verdict found her guilty of second-degree murder, official misconduct, evidence tampering, and abuse of public office. As the judge thanked the jury for its service, Rebecca lowered her head in silence. She understood that the sentence still remained, and with it, the final chapter of a story that had begun with a single conversation behind prison bars was about to reach its unavoidable conclusion. Several weeks after the guilty verdict, Rebecca Lawson returned to a courtroom that felt far quieter than it had during her trial. The packed galleries, relentless media attention, and constant courtroom drama had faded, replaced by the solemn reality of sentencing. There were no dramatic revelations left to uncover. Only consequences remained. The judge reviewed the evidence one final time before addressing Rebecca directly. "You were entrusted with extraordinary responsibility," he said. "Instead of protecting the integrity of the correctional system, you violated that trust, abused your authority, and took a human life. The damage extended far beyond one victim. It reached families, co-workers, and an entire community that depended upon your honesty." Rebecca stood silently with her hands folded before her. When offered the opportunity to speak, she slowly lifted her eyes. "There isn't a sentence this court can give me that is harsher than the life I created for myself," she said quietly. "Every decision I believed would protect me only destroyed someone else. If I had accepted the truth when I still had the chance, Daniel might still be alive." No one responded. The courtroom remained silent until the judge announced the sentence. Rebecca received 32 years in state prison for second-degree murder, evidence tampering, official misconduct, and abuse of public office. She would spend decades inside the same correctional system where she had onc. She had once enforced rules and supervised inmates. As deputies escorted her away, she briefly glanced toward Detective Olivia Grant. Olivia offered no expression of satisfaction, only quiet understanding. Days later, Rebecca arrived at a women's correctional facility several hundred miles away. The intake process mirrored procedures she had personally supervised countless times during her career. Fingerprints were taken. Personal belongings were cataloged. A prison identification number replaced the professional badge she had once worn with pride. Steel doors closed behind her one final time. This time they closed for her. The irony was impossible to ignore. Rebecca entered a cell barely larger than the office where she had once completed daily reports. As the heavy door locked, she sat alone on the narrow bunk and listened to the familiar sounds of prison life echoing through the corridor. Those noises had once represented routine employment. Now they defined the rest of her future. Detective Olivia Grant officially closed the investigation shortly afterward. Looking back over months of interviews, forensic reports, surveillance records, and witness statements, she realized the case had never been solely about murder. It had exposed how secrecy, emotional dependency, manipulation, and unequal power could quietly consume lives long before violence occurred. In her final report, Olivia wrote that corruption rarely begins with dramatic criminal acts. More often, it starts with small compromises that seem harmless until accountability disappears entirely. Meanwhile, Daniel Cross's surviving sister, Melissa Cross, refused to let the tragedy become nothing more than another forgotten headline. Together with victim advocates, correctional reform specialists, and mental health professionals, she established the Cross Initiative for Ethical Corrections, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing inappropriate relationships between correctional staff and inmates, while promoting stronger prison oversight, confidential reporting systems, ethics training, and expanded mental health support for correctional officers facing emotional burnout. The Foundation's message reached correctional academies, professional conferences, and state institutions across the country, encouraging difficult conversations about boundaries, responsibility, and the hidden dangers of emotional vulnerability within positions of authority. Blackridge State Correctional Facility also implemented stricter supervision policies, expanded camera coverage, and mandatory counseling resources for employees experiencing personal crises. Some lessons had come too late. Others might save lives in the future. Rebecca's story became a cautionary reminder that forbidden relationships built upon unequal power rarely remain secret forever. When silence replaces honesty and fear overcomes accountability, even ordinary choices can evolve into irreversible tragedy. Behind every closed door, every hidden conversation, and every carefully guarded lie waits the possibility that truth will eventually demand its price. Justice may arrive slowly, but it almost always arrives, leaving behind a lasting reminder that integrity, once abandoned, can cost far more than freedom alone.